Again, Donald Dancer enjoy the view up on top of the field. They lead it by 4 legs. Tomos Rainbow second, Cartel third. Up on the outside comes Carmine and Teresina Lobel. The half mile in 1-2 flat. Onto the clubhouse turn they go. Sizzle and Peggy leads it by 2.5 lengths. Tomos Rainbow is second. Teresina Lobel takes third. Cartel back to fourth. Beverly Hills the outside bit. Down the back stretch they go. Sizzle and Peggy leads it. Teresina Lobel moves up to take second. 2.5 over Tomos Rainbow back to third. Cartel is fourth. They move by 3/4. Sizzle and Peggy leads it. Teresina Lobel closing ground 3/4 and 1. 32 and 2. We're on the final turn they go. We've got a 2-horse battle. You can forget the rest. On top of the field is Sizzle and Peggy. Teresina Lobel is going to take a shot at her coming home as they drive to the wire. Sizzle and Peggy and Donald Dancer lead it. On the middle track, Teresina Lobel. To the wire they come. It's Sizzle and Peggy. Teresina Lobel. They are noses apart. Teresina Lobel.
That was Bob Pandolfo on Wednesday, January 28th, 2026. Welcome to Power Brush with Pandy. And, you know, I had a video about Carmine Abbatiello, I think it was about 6 months ago, but I want to have a short video because Carmine passed away yesterday at the age of 89. And Carmine was my favorite driver of all time. You know, everybody has their favorites, and I have a number of favorites, but he was my number one. You know, I was his biggest fan, and I cashed a lot of tickets with Carmine Abbatiello, and I was fortunate to get to know him a little bit because I interviewed him. I did an article when I was writing for SportsEye years ago. I wanted to do a nice long interview with Carmine because he always fascinated me because he was a very unusual driver where he could get a tremendous amount of speed out of horses that had previously hadn't, you know, shown that kind of speed. So I told my editor, Jack Rubin, I said, I want to do this interview. I'm going to set it up with Carmine. You know, I'd spoken to him, and I says, I want to call it, Why Do Horses Go Faster with Carmine? So we did a 2-part interview. It was a very long interview. I went to his house in, I think it was Colts Neck, New Jersey. He had a ranch there. He introduced me, of course, to his family and the horses that they had. They had a barn there. And we had a long interview. And it's funny because, you know, you think about a driver that can really wake horses up, and Carmine said naturally a lot of it is, you know, a communication from your hands to the driver. But he did talk about different techniques, which made the article entertaining, you know. Carmine was unusual because, I mean, in my opinion, he was the most naturally gifted driver I've ever seen. You know, most of the professional harness drivers that are good drivers or great drivers, a lot of them, you know, they all have good hands pretty much because you're not going to, you know, be very successful if you have hands of stone. But a lot of them, you know, they're successful because they're smart. You know, they make good moves on the racetrack. But Abbatiello made good moves on the racetrack, but he also had something that very few people have, where when he got into the bike, especially if it was like first time on a horse, it was different, and I'll tell you why. And I've mentioned this before, but he was so different than the other drivers that if you were handicapping a race, so let's just say post 8 was, you know, the most difficult post. Now it's very, very difficult, but back, you know, years ago it was still the most difficult post. Let's just say you were handicapping, you know, an 8-horse field at Roseville or Yonkers, and the 8-horse had a good driver, but you looked at him and you cross him out here. This horse is not going to, you know, he has no chance from post 8. You get to the racetrack and you find out that that driver is called in sick, and Carmine picked up the drive on this 8-horse, right? Well, now you have to re-handicap the race, right? Because it's not the same anymore. Because now it's like, oh boy, can Carmine, you know, I was going to play the 5 here with the 1 in the exacta box. Now Carmine's got the 8. The 5 I thought would wire the field. What if Carmine leaves? Right? Because Carmine Abbatiello could leave on the slowest horse and he could get the top. I mean, you know, owners, there's great stories where owners would say, you know, Carmine would be driving that horse for the first time, and the owner or trainer would say, this horse is, you know, he's not fast out of the gate. So just see what you can get from off the pace, and the race would start, and Carmine would zip right to the top and wire the field. And of course you don't tell a driver like a Carmine Abbatiello, you don't tell him the strategy. You hire him to drive your horse, and he does what and you shouldn't do that with any of the top drivers, especially these Hall of Fame drivers. I mean, if you're lucky enough to get one of the top drivers in the sport to drive your horse, that's his job to figure out what to do. But I mean, Abbatiello, he was interviewed by Sports Illustrated, and unfortunately, the Sports Illustrated article was on the internet for decades. And I did a search. I even did an AI search, and it's not. The link isn't there right now. That was a really good interview too. My interview and the Sports Illustrated interview, both were very good. And it was fun. It was a great quote in that Sports Illustrated interview where they said, "What's the difference?" They asked Carmine, "What's the difference between you and the other drivers?" And he held up two fingers and said, 2 seconds. And he wasn't the most modest guy when it came to his ability. They mentioned that in the Sports Illustrated article, that he kind of rubbed some of the drivers the wrong way. But I mean, he had a lot of friends, in the paddock and everything, and they got along good. The real big rivalry, in my, as I was, building my career as a handicapper and a harness rider, was between Carmine and Hervé Filion. Filion was the leading driver, and then Carmine came down from Monticello. He has been he had won a meet also at Freehold, at least one title. But then when he came down, then you really had a fierce battle between Hervé Filion and Carmine Abbatiello, who were two of the greatest drivers of all time, and they both were very they weren't the type of drivers that were going to give anything away on the track. Like Hervé Filion was a very nice guy, but a very tough driver on the track. Like he would box you in, push you wide, I mean, and if he wanted to lead, both of those drivers, Abbatiello and Hervé Filion, if they wanted to lead, like, you weren't going to get the lead, and they were both very good from the outside post and everything too. One of the things the reason why I put that video in the beginning, I was trying to find the videos, more videos when he won from off the pace, because everybody thinks of him as a front end driver, but he was a great driver. All these drivers that are really great, like the Hall of Fame drivers, they don't, even though they may have one particular style that kind of sticks out, like some drivers are more patient, some drivers are more aggressive. They all can do anything. Like John Campbell was, because of his years at the Meadowlands, was kind of thought of as an off the pace driver, but when he drove on a half-mile track, he was very aggressive, and he he's very good on front end. So you drive according to the situation and the conditions. But Abbatiello was very good from off the pace, and I mentioned this in one of my columns probably a couple of times. But there were times where I bet him, and he had, say, post 6, and I thought, he's going to go to the lead, and he took back, and I thought, oh boy, he didn't leave him. I'm probably dead in the water here. But he won from off the pace. And so what happened is the pace was faster than I had anticipated, and he knew that. I mean, he knew how to read the program. One of the things that's changed in harness racing, you don't have those big moves like you used to years ago. And there are a few videos of Carmine winning from off the pace with the big 3-wide move. You don't see that, because what Abbatiello used to do, sometimes he'd be like third over, especially at Yonkers, since they had the short stretch. He would just explode 3 wide down the back, and just come busting up to challenge, and it was very exciting, and it's kind of it's disappointing that the sport has taken that out of the sport. Recently at the Meadowlands, with the cold weather, and because it's winter, you've seen a lot of these big 3-wide moves, but it's just so cold and it's windy. But during the warmer weather with the better horses, and even at the Meadowlands, you don't see that much. The big 3-wide move on a turn, and at Yonkers, I mean, you just don't see it anymore. The big 3-wide move in the backstretch at the 3/4. It's just the races are so fast that it's just not a smart move anymore. But it was very exciting years ago, and he was one of the most exciting with that move, because he would really, bust the horse, put the horse in high gear like that, boom. One of the things he told me, we were talking about, how do you get these horses to go so fast? And he was saying that you got to keep them on their toes, and he said he would, and if you watched him, he would hold the whip and just kind of tease their tail like in the back, and he would just tap, and he would say I would tap. He says I would tap 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 tap. He says you got to keep them alert. And then he says when I was ready to go, like say from off the pace, then I'd shake the reins and I'd shout at him, And another thing he told me too, which was interesting, he says if he got on a lazy horse, and he would take the horse in the backstretch before the race, turn the whip around and give him a smack with the handle of the whip. He says just one. He says now I had his attention. He says I want him to know we got a race coming up here. Something that he said too that I thought was quite profound, and he said he says if I drive a horse for the first time, I don't care what it looks like in the program. He says, a lot of drivers, he says some drivers, they see the horse doesn't show anything, so they take back and they just figure, I'll just save ground. He says, I always look at it that I'm going to give the horse the benefit of the doubt. I never drove him before. Let me see what he can do with me in the bike. He says, so I always drive him like he's a good horse. And that's, when you look at the way he used to wake these horses up, he would get on horses that a good driver had been driving and that had been doing nothing, and he'd just, put a little lifetime mark on the horse. And of course, that confidence that he had, in my mind, there's absolutely no question that horses had more confidence when he was in the bike, and they could sense his confidence. And I was talking to Walter Case Jr. about this one time too, because Walter Case Jr. is, I would say, the only other driver I've ever seen who can wake a horse up that much, that quickly, get that, improve a horse that much off good drivers was Walter Case Jr. And the same thing, we talked about that, how he would get in the bike, and the horse would be like a different horse. And Carmine Abbatiello wasn't a big whip guy. I mean, in the stretch back then, they hit the horses a little harder than they do now. Now there's rules. But Abbatiello would bust horses out of the gate, and he didn't whip the horses out of the gate. I don't know how he did it, but I mean, the only time he really used the whip besides the teasing was in the late stages if it was a close race. But a lot of races too, he would put the field away, and with very little whip use. He only used the whip if he had to. And mainly he used it to keep the horse alive, like I was telling you. It was interesting too because he was a unique talent, and people in the industry who understood sports, people in the sports industry and in the sports media, they knew it. That's why Sports Illustrated had him on the cover. They did that interview. And Schaefer Beer, I'm going to put a link down below with the Schaefer commercial. Schaefer Beer did a commercial with him, which was beautifully filmed. So, I mean, people knew that this was a special athlete. This was a special harness driver. And he made the Hall of Fame in 1985. I just wanted to cover that. I sensed that he was very confident, but I thought he was a nice guy, and he treated me really nice at his home. It was really a nice interview. I even asked him if you bet once in a while, and his wife Maurice didn't want him to answer. But it's legal to bet. I mean, and he just told me, he says occasionally if I like a horse, he says I'll put $100 to win on him or something, But there aren't that many. There's a lot of good drivers, and I have a lot of respect for a lot of the drivers. There's a lot of good young drivers coming up now, too. In fact, at the Meadowlands, you're seeing now a whole new changeover, really, as you're starting to see different drivers make their mark at the Meadowlands. But Abbatiello was one of a kind. I mean, he had a gift. It's really, even with the technique and the things that he told me that he did, the thing is that he had something that was born into him that can't be taught. And very, naturally gifted harness driver. And, he trained horses and he owned horses and bred horses too. So he really loved horses. That's the thing too. even though he was a catch driver, these people that tend to do well in the industry, they know, they like horses. You really have to appreciate horses, and I think that's the same thing with the trainers. The really good trainers with long careers, the ones that take good care of their horses. But anyway, thanks for tuning in. I'd appreciate it if you would subscribe to my channel. It's free. Carmine Abbatiello, rest in peace, one of the all-time greats.